All right, welcome to our live stream today. My name is Chuck Ridgway. I'm the Automation Technology Manager here at Horner Automation. And I think we have some good content for you today, at least some informative content for sure. And that is how to perform bootloader updates for Horner OCS all-in-one controllers. Now, this is one of those skills that we're going to teach you today that we hope you never have to use. Because generally it's a technique that you use when, something's gone wrong during a firmware update. But it's important to be able to recover. And joining me today, as he did last week, is Mr. Nate Beachy. How we doing, Nate?
Not bad. How about you, Chuck?
I'm doing terrific. Now, in my career here at Horner, I have made lots of mistakes updating products and doing various things because obviously I've done a lot of it. How about yourself? Have you ever bricked a controller, as we like to say, from a failed firmware update?
Never. I'm always perfect. I never mess
Infallible,
up.
huh?
Of course, I've bricked lots of stuff. I mean, most of the stuff I play with is not brand new. It's been beaten up and battered around, as Tom Petty would say. But yeah, so depending on the shape of the thing or what exactly actually happened, it depends on. Yeah, case by case basis. But yeah, I've always had pretty good luck with all that
Yeah,
stuff.
me too. I mean, again, in my long career here at Horner, it's only happened to me a couple times. And it is something that's pretty rare. I mean, it's not something that happens all the time, but, it's always good for customers to be prepared for any eventuality. And we have some other good content for you today, too. So if you're thinking that, well, maybe I want to take a chance and I don't need to know much about bootloading, that's fine. We've got some other good stuff for you as well. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in to our content. All right, again, how to do bootloader updates for the Horner OCS. Okay, so about a month ago or so, we had a live stream where we talked a fair amount about firmware updates. And that's really important information, of course, because firmware updates are something that just about every Horner user will end up doing at some point. There'll be a new feature they want to take advantage of, or maybe a bug that needs to get fixed, or whatever the case may be. There'll be a reason to update firmware on a controller, and we went through that with pretty good detail. And so before we add on to that knowledge this week by talking about doing, bootable type disk creation, we're going to need to quickly review just a couple of the points from that topic about a month ago. So what is firmware? So that's the code that runs on the OCS hardware that is programmed by Horner engineers or as coded by Horner engineers that provides the product with its functionality and features. Now, that is not the same as the configuration files that are downloaded to the unit from application engineers like our customers that have the ladder logic or the IEC logic or the screens or whatever, network configuration, whatever the case may be for that particular application. The firmware is separate from that, of course. Now, there are different elements to firmware. We tend to kind of use firmware as a general purpose term. The first big element to a firmware update is the operating system. So all OCS units, since the very first one we developed back in 1998, all run effectively an operating system under the hood. It's not something the application engineer has access to, but it's integral to the unit itself. And it just varies by product family as to which specific operating system happens to be installed. But again, it's not something that normally an application engineer needs to concern themselves with. But in the subject of firmware updates and bootloader updates, it's something that's important to understand. Now, the main code that our engineers have created is the firmware, what we call the firmware files, and that resides on the microprocessor. And then in addition to that, you've also got what we call FPGA or CPLD code, and that's code that's required by some ancillary type high-speed chips that are used for high-speed counting and high-speed outputs, the type of signals that are not handled at the same rate as the logic scan, but are handled by independent chips. They require code as well, and that's part of the firmware build, if you will, and it's handled as a separate file. Okay, so that is some quick review on what is firmware and what it consists of. We also talked about, and it's important to remember, that there are effectively 3 different methods for updating firmware in a Horner controller, and they really vary mostly by the controller you have. So if you're using one of our micro OCS series products, or the XLE and XLT, or maybe one of our older Horner products from years and years ago, you can perform firmware updates no problem. You're just going to do it over a serial port or over a USB port, and you're going to do the firmware updates from Seascape itself after you've made those type of connections. Now, if you're talking about a more modern product or a larger end product like the like the XL series, which handles, we're talking anywhere from the XL4 on the way up through the XL Plus, or if you're talking about the X5 controller and specifically, those products use what we call a file set that is copied to either a USB drive or a micro SD card, and then by using kind of some built-in functionality in the unit, you can bring up a special menu and actually instigate the update from there. So that's what we would call kind of a micro SD file set type update. And then there are some products, namely the RCC, which doesn't have a screen at all, where about the only method of updating the firmware is to do a bootable micro SD. And so, that's the 3 different types of firmware update methods. Now, one of the reasons that we're covering in detail today the bootable micro SD method is because even though it's a pretty rare case when you would need to, recover a unit which had a bad firmware update or which had a firmware update that went sideways, as yes, you could say. Even though that's a pretty rare event, it's still a skill that's good to understand and know, so you're prepared. And also, we have seen a slight uptick in field reports for regular firmware updates that for whatever reason they just failed and a recovery was required. Now, we've mainly seen these, again, they're still rare, but we've mainly seen these in the 6-inch models in the XL family, the EXL6, the EXLW, and then the 10-inch EXL10. But again, it's still a rare event, but it's good to be prepared for it. And the good news is that even if this happens to you in the field, updating that unit or recovering that unit by creating a bootable micro SD drive and executing the update that way is a method that is successful in almost all cases. And generally, if it's not successful, there's been some sort of a hardware failure or something like that, and the unit's going to have to come back to the factory anyway. But again, we're showing you today would help you recover from that scenario. Okay, so let's talk about the procedure that would be followed. And don't worry, we're going to demonstrate all this. And we're not only going to demonstrate it, we're going to demonstrate it with no pre-recorded demos or anything. We're definitely, we're working without a net today, which is exciting. All right, so the first step is you need to acquire a micro SD card. So you can't use USB, it's got to be micro SD. And it really should be a 32 gigabyte or smaller card, just to make things easier. Now, what I'm showing on the screen there happens to be a 4 gigabyte Swiss bit micro SD card. That happens to be the brand that we sell. And there's a variety of reasons we sell that card. One primary reason is that they sell their products for a long time, so they don't, obsolete the smaller cards. The other thing is they are very good at not suffering from issues with other companies that are illegitimate companies, basically creating counterfeit micro SD cards. That is something that does happen in the industry, believe it or not. We've acquired large quantities of, SanDisk cards, for instance, that turned out to be counterfeit, and we bought them from a reputable source. So that can happen. But let me stress here, if you've got a situation where you've got an OCS unit that needs to be recovered, don't hesitate to go down to the drugstore, CVS, Walgreens, wherever, Walmart, whatever it takes, pick up a micro SD card, again, preferably 32 gigabytes or smaller, and then use that for your recovery. So nothing really special required in this particular process. Once you've acquired the micro SD card, you're going to download a firmware update utility, kind of something that we call a recovery utility, from the Horner website, or you're going to get it from our tech support team. Now, at this stage, as we're sitting here on April the 6th, this particular recovery package has not yet been posted on the web. So at this stage, you'll have to get it from our tech support team, but we're going to be posting it on the web here in the next few days. Now, once you've acquired the package, you're going to need to run that utility on a Windows 7 or later PC, okay? And then once you have gone through that process, which we'll demonstrate for you, then you're going to then move that memory card to the OCS itself. Now, you're always, if you're not dealing with a unit that is bricked or that is in need of recovery, if you're doing this kind of on a routine basis, make sure you back up your program before you perform the firmware update. And hopefully, even if you are recovering the unit, you did that before you started your firmware update procedure. Okay, now, once you have got the memory card formatted properly using our utility, it's plugged into the OCS, then there's going to be a button or a dip switch that you're going to have to move at power up or before you power up to cause the unit to boot from the micro SD card. Okay, once that occurs, then a pop-up screen is going to pop up that should look familiar to a lot of you who've done firmware updates before. And from there, you'll be able to finish the process by initiating the bootloader update by pressing a button on the OCS touchscreen. And then once that's completed, you should be pretty much good to go. Then it's just a matter of performing another power cycle, reloading your program, and you should be fully back up and running. Okay, so that's really the procedure we're talking about. Now, about a month ago, when we had our firmware update session, I did demonstrate at that time a bootloader update utility that we're working on, but it's not ready for prime time yet. Okay, so because we wanted to get a recovery package posted in a reasonable time frame, we decided not to wait for that utility to be completed and through all the testing before posting a recovery package. So in the interim, the recovery package that we're putting up there is using a third-party disk utility to ensure that the formatting goes properly for the operating system that's required. Because that's one of the areas in testing where with some Windows computers, there were some issues with the formatting portion of the process with our custom bootloader utility. Now, once we have that squared away, we'll release that just like we would with any product. But for now, again, we're putting a recovery package together using a third-party utility. Okay, and again, as I mentioned before, in the next couple of days, you'll have the ability to download that recovery package from our website, but we will be posting it in a location that will require a website login. So just like in the same method that you have to log into our website before you download Seascape, we're going to ask you to do the same before you download the recovery package. Okay, so that should be enough to give you an idea of the process that we're talking about here. Now it's time for us to give a live demo and see how it goes, right? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to Seascape here, and let's take a look at how we do this. All right, so one thing I want to mention is that you will download the update package, and I've done that here. All right, now the package that I've downloaded, of course, is a pre-release version, which means that the firmware that I'm going to be loading and the bootloader that I'm going to be loading and booting from is not a released version. However, in the next day or two, when 15.50 is available, the bootloader package will basically be featuring that particular version. Okay, so I've got a folder here that I created that contains the files, all right, and folders, of course. And let's take a look at what we have here. So one thing you'll notice is an application called Rufus. So Rufus is the third-party application that we're using to handle all the bootloading or all the formatting for the drives, because that was the portion that we were struggling with a little bit. So that is an application. However, you won't actually be executing that. You'll actually be executing this make USD batch file, Windows batch file. So let me go ahead and do that. I'll double click on that. And you'll see you get what you typically see when you execute a batch file. You'll get kind of a pop-up panel here and a fairly low-level operator interface, or user interface. So that's one of the reasons why we're anxious to finish our own utility with a little nicer user interface. But this is not that complicated, and I'm sure application engineers can handle this without any problem. Okay, so the first step is you have to effectively tell the utility what version or what OCS you're running. And in my case, I want to go ahead and build a bootable micro SD for an EXLW, which is a 6-inch model with a widescreen. So I find it here on the list. I don't need the can open version. I basically need the C-scan version. So it's telling me that I need to type in EXL6EW. And I'll do that now once I run down my keyboard. There we go. Okay, EXL6EW. So that's what I need to type in to get the proper file for the OCS I'm using. And then it's also going to ask me for the drive letter for my micro SD. So let's go back here to my computer, and you'll see that I have a micro SD card installed in drive E. So I'm going to go ahead and type in E as my drive letter. Okay. And then immediately it brings up that Rufus utility I was talking about. Now, do you want to allow this app to make changes to your device? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say yes and continue. Now, one thing I will mention, that is the very first time that I executed the batch file, Windows did ask me to validate that I really wanted to run that file. So I had to hit the More Info button and then go ahead and run anyway. So I think we've all seen that happen at one time or another when we've attempted to run something in Windows, and that will happen with the batch file that I initiated a couple minutes ago. But anyway, Rufus is here, and I can just press the yes because I do want it to make changes to my device. All right, and it pops up the Rufus program. Now, the good news is you don't have to make any changes to any of these settings because those have been pre-configured for you. So we can hit the start button. It does give us a warning that we are going to be erasing the data on the disk, which is important to know, of course. I'll say okay. All right. And I'll continue on. Okay, so as you can see, it's writing the image here. And it shouldn't take too much longer. It's more than halfway through. All right, just about finished. Okay, we're ready. So now that we're done with that portion, we can go ahead and say close. And then the batch file should move on. All right, what it's doing right now is it is copying the files that will need to end up on the OCS's built-in flash so the OCS can boot from those files after we complete the process of updating that OCS. So we have, as you can see here, we have success. We can press any key to continue. All right, so that completes kind of the Windows portion of the demonstration. So we've created this bootable drive now that we can put in our OCS and complete the process. So I'm going to go ahead and switch away from the Windows view, and I'm going to go ahead and go into the overhead view. So let me move my keyboard out of the way here. And I'm going to show you actually how this process works for a couple of different controllers. Actually, the first one I'm going to show you is an XL4, believe it or not. So let me bring that guy up here. Okay. All right, so what I have here is I've got an XL4. All right, and it happens to be running my super cool application that I configured for you all last week when we had our serial port session, and I demonstrated using a barcode scanner with a OCS. So that program is still on here, and I obviously haven't bricked my unit, but I still want to show you how to recover this unit in case I had bricked it. Okay, so as I mentioned in the process, you have to actually press this button or flip a switch at power up in order to initiate boot loading from a memory card, from the micro SD card. Now, in the case of the XL4, that dip switch is here on the top. So we've got switch number 1, 2, and 3. And if you go to the user's documentation for the XL4, you'll see that dip switch 1 is tied to the serial port, dip switch 2 is a spare, and dip switch 3 is factory reserved. Well, it turns out that factory reserved is the one we want. That's the one that's actually going to cause us to boot up in bootloader mode from the micro SD slot. And since we have installed a memory card that has been prepared using the same process I just showed, then I can go ahead and power cycle. All right, I flipped the switch. I'm going to go ahead and power cycle. All right, let's keep an eye on the screen and see what happens. All right, so we've installed the bootable memory card. We've flipped the switch. We've powered up the unit. And in a relatively short order, you're seeing that we're getting all kinds of error messages and a boot installer screen. So let me talk about the error messages first, just real quickly. And that is that it's normal to get error messages whenever you're doing a firmware update, because part of the firmware update is always erasing the application. So at the very least, you're going to be getting error messages at boot up saying, hey, there's no program in this controller. So I'm going to go ahead now. What just happened is this unit booted from the micro SD card. However, we have not copied the bootloader files onto the local flash memory of the device so it can boot on its own next time. So we need to hit the install bootloader button. Am I sure? I am. And this is where we effectively now wait for that process to complete. Now, this is going to take a minute or two, and we're doing it live, so there's no fast forwarding or anything. But I wanted to talk while this happens, I wanted to talk about some of those error messages that we saw while the unit booted up. And I've already mentioned the fact that you're going to get some of those error messages because the unit no longer has a program, because that was erased in the memory, the local memory. However, there are other things that were erased as well. For some of you that are eagle-eyed, you may have noticed there was also a battery missing or failed message that popped up during that initial boot up there. Why was that? Well, let me explain how the battery diagnostics works in the rechargeable battery style OCSs like the XL4 and EXL6 and XL7, etc. So effectively what happens is at power down, the OCS checks the status of the battery. If the battery is good, it effectively sets a bit that says, hey, the battery is good. If the battery's not good, it doesn't set that bit. And then on the next power up, the firmware checks that bit. Well, if that bit is not set, it flags an error. And one of the bits that were cleared on a firmware update is the bit that says the battery is good. So the first power cycle after an update, you're always going to get a battery error, but the very next power cycle, everything is back to normal. Okay, as you can see, our operation is completed and we're done. So I'll say okay here. It basically asked us to pull the drive, and I'll go ahead and do that here, and to power cycle the unit again. Now, before I do that though, this time I want the unit to boot from its own internal memory, so I need to flip this switch back to its default position, and then do my power cycle. And as a matter of fact, if I do that, it really doesn't matter if my memory card is plugged in or not, frankly. It's not going to boot from it without that dip switch being in the right position. Okay, so now we're booting, and let's keep an eye on the error messages. We still don't have a program in there. Okay. All right, we still got, for those of you who have fast eyesight, we still got the battery error. What's wrong with that? Well, keep in mind, the first time we booted, we were booting from the memory card after clearing the memory. This time that we booted, we just booted from flash memory. Again, that firmware was just updated again. So effectively, we still haven't gotten to the point where we're fully done with the update and that battery error is going to go away. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to pop my memory card back in. I'm going to go to my system menu. I'm going to go to removable media, hit enter. All right, and under default.pgm, which was the program that I saved before I started this whole process, before the live stream even began, I'm going to go ahead and load the application into this unit again. It's going to say, do you want to go into run mode? I'm going to say yes, and look what happens. Okay, so we didn't have any kind of error for the battery, and just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and power cycle it again. And this time, if we do get an error message for the battery, then I would have a little more concern that there really may be a low voltage on the battery or something. But let's take a look. Again, we got to go through the boot up process. The reason it's beta code is because that's the code I happen to be loading on there. You won't necessarily be loading beta code. And yeah, there was no battery fault. There were no faults of any kind. The self-test passed. and my application is back up and running. Okay, so that was the process for an XL4. Let's go ahead and show completing the process for that EXLW that I started on the PC. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move my XL4 out of the way here. I'll unplug it. I'm going to grab the EXLW and show that to you here. All right, okay, so this is an EXLW. This is our 6-inch controller that actually, instead of having dedicated function keys here, instead it has extra screen space. So effectively, it's got the equivalent of a 7-inch widescreen display, but we still call it the EXLW controller, W for widescreen. So let's take a look at the back of this guy. All right, and what we're going to see here is, okay, yeah, we've got dip switches on him. So I'm guessing that one of these dip switches is going to be for booting from microSD. But if I take a look here, that's not the case. And if I look in the documentation, I'll see that's not the case. These dip switches are dedicated to other functions, all serial port functions. Termination for RS-485 and converting a port to half duplex from full duplex. So that's not going to work. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Well, if you look on this side, we've got our memory card. We've got our mini USB port. And you may just barely be able to see a little opening there with a recessed push button. That actually is the button that we're going to use to boot from microSD. Now, it's not a slide switch, it is a push button. Now, this will be a little bit trickier, right? Because it's not just a matter of flipping a switch and plugging it in. We're going to have to hold that button in and then apply power. So I wanted to kind of show you a more difficult one, if you will. It's still not that difficult, but we'll see how we do here, right? Because this requires, it's kind of like the equivalent of putting my hand on my head and rubbing my belly or something like that. So we'll see how I do. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have the power ready to go in, and I'm actually going to use my right hand, which is the one you see here, to kind of push against the unit, or use as a backstop, if you will. And then on this side, I've got a small screwdriver that I'm going to use to push the button in with. Now, the good news is that you can absolutely feel the tactile feedback on this button. So there's no question this button has been pressed. And as I'm pressing it, I'm going to go ahead and apply power to the unit and then let go. Now, I may have let go a little early because my hand slipped. So we'll see what happens. So this may be the epic chuck fail here. We shall see. That's the great thing about live demos. And I think it was actually an epic chuck fail here because it's booting like normal. Okay, so we get to try this again. How about that? So this, if you were actually trying to recover a unit, you would actually have seen that the unit still won't boot. In my case, I had a unit that didn't need to be recovered. So let's try this again. I'll get my right hand ready, get it poised, get the switch put down there, which it is. All right, and then I'll go ahead, and it is a little tricky here. So obviously my manual dexterity is not at the top of the food chain. All right, that time I think I got it. So remember what I did there was I pushed the button while I powered up, and then I let go of the button after I had applied power. Ah, there we go. Now we've got all of our errors that we would expect to get. Okay, so this is the process that we expected to happen. Now we have effectively booted from microSD, and it's ready for us to hit the install bootloader button, which I'll go ahead and do now, but I won't make you, sit through a minute and a half or so of firmware copying as the firmware files are copied from the memory card over to the local flash of this EXLW. Okay, so we'll kind of call that our demonstration, if you will, on how to do updates on a couple different controllers. Again, booting from microSD, first creating a bootable disk in Windows, and then taking that bootable disk, installing it in the controller, and either flipping a dip switch or pushing a button in while we apply power, and then continuing the process from there. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. I've got a little bit more content to provide you today, or a few announcements to make before we wrap up with Nate. And let me go ahead and continue on here. So one thing I'm excited to announce is that after much anticipation, we have finally gotten to the point where we will absolutely be posting Seascape 9.9 Service Pack 4 on the website this week. So within the next day or two, you absolutely will find Seascape 9.9 Service Pack 4, along with the firmware that goes with it to provide a lot of extensive new features and some bug fixes, of course, for the OCS line of all-in-one controllers. Now, the reason why Service Pack 9.9 SP4 is so anticipated, if you will, and I'll skip that slide for a minute, but the reason why that's so anticipated is because we've added a bunch of new enhancements to logic. So advanced ladder logic with tags, enhanced IEC, really the first IEC enhancements that we've made that are really, really significant in many, many years. So it's definitely a well-anticipated release. So naturally, the question is, well, what took us so long? Okay, because we've been talking about 9.9 Service Pack 4 for some time now. Well, one thing we did after launching Service Pack 3 is that we learned that we were better off implementing a more formal, extensive beta testing period. And we definitely did that with Service Pack 4. And that lasted for about a month. And we got some great feedback from the beta testers. And these were a combination of beta testers from some of our distribution partners, some of the application engineers from our distribution partners, to some of our longtime customers who wanted to test it out. And we got a lot of great feedback. And because of that, we thought it was important to incorporate as many of their suggestions as possible, again, from this beta group into the actual release itself, instead of waiting and just putting those in with Seascape 10 or something. So again, that caused a little further delay while we went ahead and added those suggested features. And they weren't all features, of course. A couple of them were bugs that they found. So that was important too. So part of the delay was because we did the beta program. Part of the delay was because we incorporated a lot of suggestions from the beta program. And part of the delay was, well, just because stuff happens, right? So, it didn't go as fast as we all wanted to. But the good news is it's here. And you're definitely not going to want to miss the next 2 weeks, because for the next 2 weeks on our Tuesday live streams, we're going to be unpacking a lot of these great new features in Service Pack 4, ones that we've maybe talked about a little bit before, but we're going to be unpacking them in detail. So next week, we're going to be focused on some new features, especially ones that are affiliated with the advanced ladder logic, especially the tag-based advanced ladder or variable-based advanced ladder. And then the week after that, in our live stream, we're going to be covering the IEC 61131 related new features. And those are really exciting because we're talking about things like much improved performance, greater capacity by far. We're talking about simulation and great new debugging tools and online programming, all the things that we want to show off with Service Pack 4 for enhanced IEC, things people have asked for years. We're going to get those fully unpacked 2 weeks from today. Okay, and then in between those two, we've got a week from this Thursday, we have our X10 launch webinar. So the X10 is our newest OCS model we will be releasing on April 15th, which effectively is the largest member of the micro OCS product family. And we're going to be launching that with a full webinar. You'll need to register for that guy. It's not going to be streamed live on YouTube. It will be replayed on YouTube, but not live. So join us for the live webinar. You'll need to register on our website. We've also, I believe, got a link in the description below that you can register from. And then, of course, if you're on the Horner mailing list, you'll also have another opportunity through there. But don't miss this one. I'm excited to show this off as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring Nate back in. All right, if I can remember which button to press. There we go. There's my man, Nate.
Too many buttons.
I'm telling you. But I've managed to press most of the right buttons today. For those who were joining us and just sitting around waiting for the live stream to begin, when it first kind of went live, at least for the 10-minute countdown or so, I forgot to mute my microphone. So you got to hear some good back and forth while Nate and I kind of, talked about, what the delay looked like and all that kind of good stuff. So I never hesitate to hit the wrong button at least once per broadcast. Getting back to our topic today, Nate. So I believe as you saw, I updated an XL4 as well as an EXLW today using this, bootable micro SD procedure. What controllers have you tried that on?
I've tried them on all of them. I work here, so I've tried it on pretty much all of our products. I'll say that XL4 and the EXL6, along with the EXL6W that you had and the XL10, those are all pretty much a quick update, like you saw a minute, as it says on the screen there. The XL Plus is a little bit different animal. It does take around 10 minutes to do this bootloader update, so that's one of the differences there.
That's really good information to know. The XL Plus has a lot of enhancements. It's got more horsepower, of course. Larger screen is obvious, but it's got a lot more horsepower. It has, for instance, the ability to support full screen video and audio with video and a whole bunch of other things. It's got the fastest scan time of any of the controllers. It's got a different operating system. It's a variation on the standard operating system we use, but it's a slightly different operating system. And there's just a lot more files. So 10 minutes is significant over a 1 or 2 minute update for sure. I believe you had mentioned to me earlier that you also had updated an XL7 earlier today. Does the XL7 use that push button switch that's recessed, or does it use a dip switch?
No, the XL7 is switches just like the XL4 is. So that means the EXL6, the EXL6W, and the EXL10, basically if it starts with an E, it's going to have the recessed push button.
Okay.
As well as the XL Plus does have the recessed push button.
All right, and I demonstrated very clearly that even if you don't get it right exactly on the first time with pressing your button versus plugging it in, try and try again. So on my second try, I got it.
Right. The trick there, I guess, is if you're able to watch the screen at the same time as doing all that other stuff, you press the button until you see the please wait, at which point it's okay to let go of the button.
Okay, got it. All right, more good information from Nate. That's why we love to have him on with us.
Yep.
Okay, so that's it for this week.
We do have one question here in the that thing, the chat bar.
Okay.
On YouTube.
Sounds like we have a question.
And I did answer it, but I'll go ahead and highlight it anyway. Peter brought up the XL Plus and how the hole for the boot up is actually pretty hard to hit without a paper clip or something. It's actually smaller than the one on the EXLW that you showed there. Was wondering if you lose power during a boot load recovery like this, do you actually truly brick the unit? And I guess the answer to that is no, not really, because the bootloader process actually boots up completely from the memory card as opposed to the internal memory.
Absolutely.
And then he, is it possible to have a countdown timer? He's also asking if there's possible to have a countdown timer on the screen during the bootloader install, especially on the XL Plus, because it does take a long time, and that would be a great feature to have. I agree. Currently, we don't have that, but we should look into that if possible.
Well, yeah, especially since if people are used to the amount of time it takes to on one of our smaller products like an XL4 or an XL7, they're going to get impatient and think that something's gone wrong, and that's obviously not the case.
And there's not really any feedback as far as how far along it is, if it's still doing something. So yeah, that would be a great addition for that. For
Absolutely.
Sure.
Now, go ahead.
I was gonna. I think you highlighted this basically with the title of the video and everything, but this pushing a button and powering up or flipping a switch and powering up to boot from a micro SD is only required if you've got a unit that does not want to come up. Ways of updating the firmware and the bootloader for that matter, if your unit works just fine, like your EXL6W and your XL4, they both powered up fine. You don't have to make a special disk and go through the whole special process just to do a bootloader update, which you may want to do if you want a custom splash screen, for instance. So the custom, graphic logo that pops up before the whole thing starts running. All that stuff does require a bootloader, but just that or just a regular firmware update does not require the special disk and the whole power-up sequence stuff, just to make that clear.
Absolutely. And for those who are interested in the standard kind of non-emergency firmware update procedure, I will once again push the fact that about a month ago, we had a live stream all about firmware updates with the OCS, and all that is covered in a lot of detail. And I will say this, I have found a screwdriver that is perfect for pushing that button. So I don't think it was designed for that, but it works on the RCC and it works on all of our products that have a hole. So there are a small screwdriver similar to the size that you would use for...
Small screwdriver.
Yeah, similar to the size you'd use maybe for eyeglasses or something. But this one I actually bought at a hardware store. So how about it?
Yeah.
All right, there you go.
And then, yeah, I guess depending on who you ask, whether, depending on who you ask, if your controller is working fine and we announce that we have new firmware and this and that, but you're not actually, you don't have a bug that you need fixed or you don't have a feature that you want to use, there's no reason to update firmware just for the heck of it. But if you want to, go ahead. I'm just saying that if it ain't broke, then, don't try to fix it kind of thing.
That's a good...
Just to put that.
That's a great thing to mention, and that is that I know a lot of customers or people in general say, well, I've got to have the latest firmware and I've got to have the latest software. I need to update every single time, and really that's why the release notes are so important. So next week we're going to unpack Service Pack 4 along with firmware 15.5, and you can bet I'm going to be showing the release notes, where to get them, and covering all the things that we did, and letting people decide if upgrading their firmware in their unit to take advantage of some of those things is important or not. But again, like Nate said, if you've got the machine running the way you want it, or the system, whatever it happens to be, it's deployed in the field, it's fully tested, everything's great, unless there's a compelling event, I've got to take advantage of this new feature, I've got to fix this bug, whatever. Usually, like Nate says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. All right.
Yep.
Thanks, Nate. Okay, so
no problem.
Reminding you again that next Tuesday we start unpacking Service Pack 4, especially the features as they relate to Advanced Ladder and Advanced Ladder variable based. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.